At 5:46 a.m., on October 12, 1941, a thin layer of cold mist drifted across the runway at Henderson Field as a B-15 bomber sat parked in the half-light, its aluminum skin beating with dawn moisture. 3 mechanics balanced on wooden ladders around its nose, brushes in hand, finishing the last bold strokes of a giant eagle spreading its wings across the fuselage. The air smelled of gasoline, wet paint, and the metallic tang of early morning humidity. Private First Class Daniel Mercer, 23 years old, a former sign painter from rural Ohio, leaned forward on the highest rung, tightening the curve of the eagle's eye with the calm precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times on store windows, just never on a combat aircraft. Below him, 2 ground crewmen stood with arms crossed, staring up with a mix of confusion, suspicion, and the kind of tired amusement only men on a pre-dawn shift could muster. "What in the world is he doing to our bomber?" one muttered. "Painting a bird," the other replied. "A really big one." Around them, the flight line woke slowly, engines coughing to life in the distance, tools clattering against toolbox lids, and the faint rumble of bomb carts rolling between hangars. A crew chief walked past, stopped mid-stride, squinted at the artwork, and sighed hard enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't an art fair, Mercer," he barked. "We fly in 3 hours. That better wash off." Mercer didn't look down. He kept brushing, pulling wide strokes to shape the wings under the cockpit windows. The eagle's silhouette, even half-finished, distorted the bomber's natural outline. Exactly what he wanted. Exactly what no manual ever approved. 2 days earlier, their squadron had lost 3 B-15 seconds on the same route, each hit by Japanese anti-air batteries that seemed able to lock onto them long before they reached bombing altitude. Crews swore the enemy gunners were predicting their path too accurately, firing not where the bomber was, but where it would be. Mercer had noticed something else. Seabirds along the coast avoided the guns entirely when they banked low over the water. Their shadows broke up, their shapes warped in the morning haze. Watching them gave him the kind of idea that gets you laughed at, written up, or both. He dipped the brush again. Above the runway, the sun finally broke the horizon, lighting the eagle's wings in a sharp flash of gold and white. "Stupid," one mechanic whispered. Maybe it was, but in 3 hours, this B-15 would fly straight into the teeth of a coastal gun line that had shredded every bomber before it, and Mercer was betting everything that this ridiculous eagle might be the only thing that kept them alive. The mist had barely lifted when the rest of the airfield stirred to life, revealing the full sprawl of Henderson Field in late 1941, a rough forward operating base, straddling the edge of the Pacific, where everything smelled of oil, salt, and restless anticipation. The B-15 squadron stationed here flew low-altitude strike missions along coastal gun lines, and every pilot knew these routes were deadly because the enemy had spent months perfecting overlapping arcs of anti-aircraft fire that turned the shoreline into a carefully engineered kill zone. Each bomber relied on a small ground crew that worked through the night, and these teams had grown accustomed to the grim routine of patching torn metal, repainting blast marks, and checking fuel lines for shrapnel tears that seemed to appear after almost every mission. Despite its size, the B-15 remained a vulnerable aircraft because its silhouette was unmistakable from below, allowing enemy gunners to lock in predictive trajectories with unnerving accuracy and strike the bomber long before it could climb to safer altitudes. The pilots who flew these missions had begun to speak quietly among themselves, describing patterns in the enemy's firing solutions that suggested training, discipline, and an almost mathematical understanding of the bomber's path. Even the intelligence officers admitted that Japanese coastal batteries were improving rapidly, using carefully staggered bursts that bracketed the approaching aircraft and forced them into fatal corrections. On the ground, the tempo of pre-flight preparation was as relentless as the humidity, with mechanics rolling tool carts between aircraft, armorers loading racks of bombs beneath half-open hangars, and radio crews checking frequencies that often crackled with static from the dense tropical air. Every man on the flight line understood that their squadron had lost more aircraft in the last 2 weeks than in the previous 2 months combined, and the morale that once filled the base had thinned into a grim quiet that settled over the operations tents like a second layer of morning fog. Commanders issued briefings filled with clipped sentences, emphasizing speed, altitude discipline, and evasive turns, yet the crews knew these instructions rarely matched the chaotic reality of flying at treetop height under converging fire. The B-15 itself was an odd contradiction, built to deliver heavy ordnance with surprising agility, yet cursed with broad wings and a deep belly that cast a perfect shadow on the sea below, making it easy prey for any gunner trained to read, contrast, and motion. Pilots complained that the aircraft felt steady during bombing runs but sluggish when pulling out, leaving them exposed to follow-up volleys that often erupted from hidden positions along cliffs or camouflaged bunkers concealed beneath palm groves. Ground crews worked tirelessly to offset these weaknesses, adjusting engine timing, reinforcing control surfaces, and marking stress fractures with grease pencils. Yet none of these solutions addressed the fundamental problem that enemy batteries could see them too clearly and too early. Even the veterans who had flown the B-15 since its first deployment understood that something had changed along the coast, because the Japanese defenders now seemed to anticipate every maneuver before the pilots even touched their throttles. This awareness created a heavy tension that permeated the base, and it was this tension that made Daniel Mercer's bizarre eagle design stand out so sharply against the rigid discipline of wartime routine, drawing skeptical glances from officers who could not decide whether to reprimand him or simply pretend they had never seen the nose art at all. Yet beneath their annoyance simmered a quiet desperation, because everyone on that field knew that the squadron could not endure many more missions like the last ones, and any idea, no matter how foolish it appeared, carried the faint possibility of altering the odds. For weeks, the flight crews had whispered about the same unnerving pattern, noting that the enemy's gunfire did not simply reach for them but arrived precisely where their aircraft were headed, as if the Japanese gunners possessed an invisible blueprint of every B-15 that ventured along the coastline. The bomber's broad wings and deep underbelly created a silhouette that stood out starkly against the pale reflection of the morning sea, giving coastal batteries an almost perfect visual reference for calculating lead angles long before the pilots realized they had been spotted. Even minor course corrections failed to break this pattern, because the aircraft's distinct outline allowed trained observers to anticipate each movement with frightening confidence. Pilots returning from missions described how the first bursts often erupted several hundred yards ahead of their nose, forcing them into abrupt evasive maneuvers that only exposed them to secondary volleys positioned exactly where instinct would push them next. Intelligence officers studying recovered shell fragments confirmed that the enemy was coordinating fire between multiple batteries, using overlapping patterns designed to trap the bomber in a tightening ring of explosions, from which escape became nearly impossible under low-altitude constraints. Some crews attempted to mask their approach by flying slightly higher, yet this tactic only made them more vulnerable to heavier guns mounted on cliffside installations that commanded near-perfect line of sight across the entire bay. The B-15's own aerodynamic profile contributed to the problem, because its long belly and rounded engine nacelles produced a shadow that stretched ahead of the aircraft during dawn missions, acting like a dark arrow that pointed directly at its intended flight path. Japanese spotters, trained to watch for these subtle distortions on the water's surface, used the shadow's movement to refine their predictions with uncanny precision, transforming the bomber's most basic physical features into liabilities that no amount of piloting skill could fully overcome. Engineers, stationed at Henderson Field, had studied the issue for months, yet every proposed solution seemed to require substantial redesigns that were far beyond the capacity of a forward-deployed maintenance team already stretched thin. Ground crews grew increasingly frustrated as they patched the same types of battle damage after every mission, noticing how most strikes clustered along the belly panels, where the gunfire intersected the aircraft's predicted flight arc. Some mechanics whispered that the enemy could almost read the bomber like a chart, identifying its speed, angle, and climb profile from a single glimpse of its shadow or silhouette. Although officers dismissed such talk as exaggeration fueled by fatigue, the evidence on the hangar floor, twisted metal, burned wiring, and scorched insulation suggested that the enemy's calculations were far more deliberate and technical than anyone wanted to admit. This growing realization fed a sense of quiet dread throughout the base, because it implied that the B-15's vulnerability was not a temporary imbalance, but a structural flaw deeply embedded in its design philosophy. The aircraft had been built for payload and stability, not for visual deception, and the stark contrast of its underside made it a perfect target for defenders who relied on optical cues rather than mechanical rangefinders. Pilots understood that each mission now demanded not just courage but a measure of blind luck, because even their best evasive maneuvers failed against an opponent who seemed to anticipate their actions the moment they began. Crews gathered each night in the dimly lit mess hall, sharing clipped conversations about the tightening kill zones and the eerie precision of the enemy barrages, with many admitting quietly that the bomber's silhouette had become its own worst enemy. The officers offered reassurances, but beneath those words lay the unspoken truth that everyone on the airfield sensed. Unless something fundamentally changed about the way the B-15 appeared from below, the squadron's losses would continue to rise until there were no aircraft left to fly. The growing sense of inevitability surrounding each mission became painfully real as the squadron watched the cumulative toll of their losses mount across the far end of the airfield, where damaged bombers were dragged into a row of makeshift repair bays that increasingly resembled a graveyard of twisted aluminum and scorched paint. One aircraft returned with its belly torn open by a single, perfectly placed shell that had ignited the fuel manifold and gutted the fuselage so thoroughly that the crew chief could only stare at the wreckage in stunned silence. Another bomber limped home trailing a ribbon of black smoke, its starboard engine coughing violently, as two medics rushed to extract a gunner who had been thrown against his turret housing by the force of an explosion they never saw coming. Pilots who had once carried themselves with swagger now walked across the tarmac with hollow eyes, each recounting nearly identical stories of how the enemy's opening bursts erupted ahead of their nose rather than behind it, forcing them into desperate evasive dives that led directly into second and third volleys, positioned with unnerving precision. One young lieutenant described how the first shells detonated so close to his cockpit that he could feel the shock wave hit his chest before he even registered the flashes in front of him, leaving him convinced that the gunners on the cliffs had anticipated his every move before he had made it. Even the seasoned veterans, men who had flown combat missions over China and the Philippines, admitted quietly that they had never encountered defenders who seemed to understand their aircraft with such ruthless clarity. The crews could measure the rising danger not just in wreckage but in the atmosphere of the base itself, which grew heavier with each sunrise as new missions were assigned, despite the growing certainty that at least one bomber would not return. Mechanics worked through the night repairing ruptured hydraulic lines and replacing scorched wiring bundles while overhearing fragments of grim conversations between pilots who wondered aloud whether they would still be alive by the week's end. In the mess hall, officers spoke in low voices about ammunition patterns recovered from damaged aircraft, noting how the enemy had begun using staggered fire to herd the B-15 seconds toward predetermined kill pockets carved into the coastline. One particularly brutal mission left a lasting mark on the entire squadron when 3 bombers pushed through dense pre-dawn haze, only to be met by a barrage so accurate it shattered the lead aircraft in the span of 5 seconds, sending burning debris spiraling into the sea while the remaining crews screamed warnings into their radios. The second bomber attempted a hard climb to escape the overlapping bursts, but was caught by a direct hit that tore through the fuselage and ignited the ordnance load before the pilot could jettison it, creating a fireball visible from miles away. Only the third aircraft survived the encounter, returning to base with its tail nearly severed, and the radio operator covered in soot and blood as he recounted how the bursts had seemed to walk toward them with deliberate, methodical intent. These losses carved into the morale of every man stationed at Henderson Field, because each new wreck made it painfully clear that the danger was no longer random or circumstantial, but the result of a systemic vulnerability the enemy had learned to exploit with devastating effect. The officers tried to maintain discipline, yet even they could not ignore the pattern forming in the casualty reports, which showed that the majority of downed aircraft had been hit in nearly the same places along the belly panels and engine nacelles. With every mission that ended in smoke and wreckage, the unspoken fear grew harder to suppress that the B-15 might simply be too predictable, too easily read, and too perfectly outlined against the morning sea to survive much longer. By the time the squadron gathered for the next pre-flight briefing, a heavy silence filled the operations tent, because no one needed to be reminded of the stakes anymore. The empty bunks, the darkened workshops, and the burnt-out shells at the edge of the field spoke loudly enough for all of them. As the wreckage continued piling up along the far edges of the field, a few mechanics and flight engineers began quietly comparing notes, searching for any consistent pattern that might explain why the enemy seemed to anticipate the B-15's movements with such uncanny precision. They pored over battered panels scattered across the repair bays, tracing the arcs of shrapnel scars and measuring the angles at which shells had pierced the aircraft, slowly realizing that most of the damage clustered along the belly, where the bomber's silhouette appeared sharpest against the pale reflection of the sea. This discovery raised unsettling questions among the ground crews, who understood better than anyone how the aircraft's underside created a geometric outline, almost tailor-made for enemy spotters, trained to read, shape, and contrast, rather than mechanical instruments. Daniel Mercer listened to these conversations while working long hours under dim floodlights, quietly forming a hypothesis that no officer would ever entertain because it fell so far outside conventional doctrine. He believed the Japanese gunners were not merely skilled but highly disciplined observers who had learned to exploit the bomber's outline by reading the strong contrast between its light underbelly and the shimmering water below, allowing them to predict its path with split-second accuracy, long before the crew even saw the first muzzle flashes. This idea gained traction in his mind each time he recalled seeing seabirds break up their shadows while diving low over the coastline, their silhouettes warping in the morning haze, in ways that made them difficult to track, even with a trained eye. When Mercer attempted to explain his theory to a senior engineer, the man dismissed him with a weary glance, insisting that no amount of visual distortion could outweigh the predictable geometry of a bomber flying at fixed speeds and altitudes during a strike run. The engineer argued that defensive fire improved because the enemy was learning their routines, not because they possessed some extraordinary ability to read the aircraft's shape. Although Mercer respected the man's experience, he could not shake the conviction that something more subtle was at play, especially after hearing pilots describe how the bursts seemed to land exactly along the predicted arc of their climbs, rather than their actual course corrections. The real barrier emerged when Mercer broached the topic with his crew chief, who reminded him that official camouflage patterns were strictly regulated, and that altering the underside of an aircraft without written authorization would violate maintenance guidelines designed to ensure consistency across the fleet. Any deviation, no matter how minor, risked disciplinary action because the Army Air Forces feared that individual experiments might compromise recognition signals or confuse escort fighters during chaotic operations. This rigid adherence to procedure had served the military well in most circumstances, but here it created a wall Mercer could not easily climb because his theory depended on the unorthodox idea that the bomber's greatest weakness might be its own unchanging appearance. Despite the pushback, Mercer continued refining his thoughts during late-night shifts, replaying pilot testimonies and tracing the patterns of battle damage across half-dismantled fuselages, convinced that the solution lay not in altering tactics or engine performance, but in disrupting the visual cues that enemy gunners relied on. He understood that any attempt to implement such a change would require either explicit permission or quiet defiance, and neither option offered comforting consequences for a low-ranking mechanic stationed far from home. Yet the rising stack of casualty reports made it impossible for him to ignore the troubling possibility that the squadron's survival now hinged on someone challenging assumptions ingrained so deeply into procedure that no officer had questioned them in months. By the end of that week, Mercer stood at the edge of the tarmac, watching another damaged B-15 being towed into the repair line, its belly charred and its outline horribly familiar, and realized that the true enemy might not only be the coastal batteries, but the unwavering belief that the aircraft's design could not be meaningfully altered. That realization planted the final seed of defiance in his mind, setting the stage for a decision that would break regulations, anger his superiors, and ultimately reshape the fate of every bomber that flew into the teeth of those meticulously trained guns. Daniel Mercer had never intended to become the kind of mechanic who questioned doctrine, yet the trajectory of his life had always pushed him toward noticing the small details everyone else overlooked, beginning with the years he spent painting storefront signs and billboard illustrations across rural Ohio, long before anyone had heard the name Pearl Harbor. Growing up in a quiet town where the most exciting event of the month was the delivery of new supply trucks to the hardware store, Mercer had learned early that careful observation mattered more than raw talent, because customers expected their lettering crisp, their colors even, and their designs balanced in ways that felt natural without drawing attention to themselves. This slow, meticulous discipline seeped into his habits as he matured, shaping an eye for proportion and contrast that later proved far more valuable on the airfield than he ever could have imagined. When the war in Europe intensified, Mercer enlisted with the hope of using his hands for something practical rather than artistic, believing the nation needed mechanics more urgently than painters. Basic training refined his sense of responsibility but did little to dull his curiosity, and instructors frequently complained that he asked too many questions about engine timing, aerodynamic stress, and panel construction for a man expected merely to follow orders. Yet his natural aptitude for precision quickly earned him a place among the maintenance crews destined for forward airfields, where his steady hands and calm temperament made him a reliable asset in the chaotic environment surrounding combat operations. Despite this, the veterans in his unit often teased him about his artistic background, calling him the sign man or paint boy, depending on how many hours they had spent repairing bullet holes the night before. These jabs never bothered Mercer, because he understood they arose more from exhaustion than malice, and he continued performing his duties with quiet dedication, observing every anomaly that drifted across the flight line like a puzzle waiting to be solved. He noticed how certain aircraft returned with unusual scorch patterns near the engine nacelles, how the morning haze altered the color of the underside panels, and how shadows shifted across the water as the bombers passed overhead during test climbs. While most mechanics focus solely on the mechanical state of the aircraft, Mercer developed a habit of analyzing how each bomber appeared from various angles, as though studying a subject for a painting rather than preparing it for war. This habit occasionally annoyed his crew chief, who insisted that no amount of visual observation could replace proper mechanical procedure. Yet Mercer found himself unable to ignore the subtle clues that seemed to whisper deeper truths about the aircraft's vulnerabilities. His quiet nature and thoughtful demeanor sometimes made him appear aloof to the pilots, who preferred mechanics with louder voices and quicker assurances, yet even they respected his uncanny ability to spot hairline cracks or alignment issues long before they evolved into critical failures. Mercer never bragged about these skills, but the crews quickly learned that airplanes he serviced tended to fly more smoothly and return with fewer mechanical surprises than those handled by others. Over time, this reputation fostered a sense of trust between him and the airmen, who often sought his opinion about unusual vibrations or strange shadows they noticed during low-altitude runs. Their concerns matched the strange patterns Mercer had already been collecting in his mind, reinforcing his belief that the squadron's problems stemmed from factors no checklist could adequately address. Despite his growing expertise, Mercer remained acutely aware of his place in the rigid hierarchy of the airfield, knowing that mechanics were expected to repair the aircraft, not question the principles guiding their use or design. This awareness weighed heavily on him during late-night shifts, as he contemplated the implications of his evolving theory about visual distortion and enemy gunnery, understanding that any action he took would require stepping far outside the bounds of what the Army Air Forces considered acceptable. Yet each new loss pressed against the edges of his restraint, pushing him toward a decision shaped not by ambition or rebellion, but by an earnest desire to protect the men who trusted his hands with their lives. In that growing tension between duty and innovation, Mercer discovered a resolve he had never expected to possess, one that would soon propel him into the heart of a dangerous experiment that might either save the squadron or end his career before the next sunrise. The idea that eventually changed everything arrived not as a sudden flash of genius, but as a slow, persistent realization that settled into Mercer's thoughts during one of those quiet dawn hours when the airfield felt suspended between exhaustion and expectation, and every sound echoed with unusual clarity across the open tarmac. He had stepped away from the hangar to stretch his legs, carrying a tin of primer in one hand, while watching a flock of seabirds drift lazily above the coastline, their wings catching the pale light in broad, sweeping arcs that contrasted sharply against the shimmering water below. As he studied their movement, Mercer noticed something peculiar. The birds' shadows warped and stretched unpredictably whenever they shifted their wings, breaking their outline into shapes that were difficult to track, even with his painter's trained eye. The observation might have passed as nothing more than a momentary curiosity, had it not coincided with the memory of a pilot describing how the early bursts of enemy fire always seemed to overshoot slightly whenever the bomber shifted course at low altitude. Mercer found himself recalling the pilot's exact words, spoken in a weary voice that carried the weight of too many close calls. "It's almost like they lose us for a split second whenever the light hits just right." That phrase echoed through Mercer's mind as he continued watching the seabirds, slowly realizing that the distortion caused by rapid changes in shape, contrasted with moving light, might be confusing to anyone relying solely on visual anticipation. The idea tightened its grip on him when a single bird broke from the flock, diving sharply toward the water with its wings partially folded, creating a silhouette so drastically different from its earlier profile that Mercer instinctively blinked to regain focus. It was in that blink, that small, involuntary pause, that he recognized the potential significance of what he was seeing. The creature had altered its outline completely through nothing more than a simple shift in posture, momentarily hiding its trajectory, even from a trained observer. If a mechanic like him could lose track of a bird's motion for an instant, then perhaps a gunner calculating predictive fire might experience a similar disruption when confronted with an unexpected visual pattern. As he returned to the hangar, Mercer felt an unfamiliar excitement building beneath his fatigue, nudging him toward the scattered panels and paint tins that cluttered the maintenance area. He set down the primer and began sketching rough shapes in the dirt floor using a piece of broken chalk, drawing and redrawing the outline of the B-15's underside while searching for a way to break its clean geometric silhouette. His painter's instincts guided his hand as he shaded exaggerated wings, curved lines, and distorted forms that might confuse the eye by disrupting the bomber's easily recognizable profile. The sketches evolved into something more lifelike as he worked, eventually resembling a broad-winged eagle with a fierce gaze and uneven feather patterns that twisted around the nose of the aircraft in a way that felt naturally chaotic. Mercer crouched over his drawings, imagining how the pattern might appear from below when framed by shifting sunrise light and the reflective surface of the sea. The possibility that such a design could distort the enemy's visual calculations surged through him with startling clarity, and he realized he had stumbled upon an idea that bridged his mechanical duty with the artistic instincts he had long considered irrelevant to the war. Although he knew the concept violated every camouflage regulation in the manual, he also sensed that it offered something none of the engineers or officers had considered: a method of tampering, not with the aircraft's machinery, but with the enemy's perception. He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his knees, and stared at the rough outline of the eagle one last time as the sun climbed higher over the ridge. In that moment, the notion ceased to be a whimsical thought and solidified into a tangible plan, a fragile yet compelling idea that might provide the squadron with the sliver of unpredictability they desperately needed. Mercer felt the familiar blend of fear and determination settle into his chest, understanding that he would now have to decide whether to follow the rules that kept the airfield running or break them entirely in pursuit of a solution no one had asked for but everyone needed. When Mercer finally gathered enough resolve to share his idea, he approached his crew chief during a lull in the afternoon rush, believing that the quiet moment might soften the reaction he feared was coming. He explained his observations about the seabirds, demonstrated the distorted silhouettes he had sketched, and attempted to show how a large eagle painted across the bomber's underside could break the clean outline the enemy gunners relied upon so effectively. The crew chief listened with his arms folded tightly across his chest, his expression shifting gradually from curiosity to impatience, as Mercer sketched a rough design on a scrap panel left leaning against the tool shed. After several minutes of strained silence, the chief finally exhaled sharply and shook his head, dismissing the proposal with the weary authority of someone who had heard too many desperate ideas from men pushed to their limits. He reminded Mercer that military aircraft adhered to strict camouflage regulations for a reason, emphasizing that unauthorized markings could interfere with recognition by friendly fighters or complicate communication during joint operations with Navy patrol aircraft. His voice hardened as he added that, regardless of how clever the theory sounded, the Army Air Forces did not authorize field-level crews to redesign visual patterns based on personal intuition or half-tested concepts. Mercer attempted to argue that the existing camouflage clearly wasn't working against coastal batteries trained to read subtle visual cues, but the chief cut him off, insisting that the squadron needed discipline more than improvisation, especially at a time when morale was already stretched thin. The dismissal stung, not because it was unexpected, but because Mercer realized the man viewed his idea as a distraction rather than a potential solution. Word of his proposal spread through the maintenance crew within hours, carried by murmurs that wrapped themselves in equal parts amusement and skepticism, creating a cloud of quiet mockery that followed him across the tarmac. Mechanics who normally respected his attention to detail now exchanged smirks whenever he passed, joking that he should go back to the art shop or paint wings on the whole airfield if he thought it would help. Some offered kinder, though still dismissive, advice by suggesting that he focus on engine work instead of daydreaming about art projects on combat aircraft. Mercer's cheeks burned with embarrassment each time he overheard these comments, yet beneath the sting lay a stubborn sense of conviction that refused to fade despite the ridicule. The most crushing blow came when a senior officer summoned him to the operations tent having heard an exaggerated version of his idea that framed it as a frivolous attempt to decorate the squadron's bombers for entertainment rather than survival. The officer delivered a stern lecture about maintaining professionalism, explaining that the airfield operated on strict schedules that left no room for unauthorized experiments or cosmetic indulgences. He warned Mercer that any further discussion of such unauthorized modifications would lead to formal disciplinary action, emphasizing that the squadron could not afford even the slightest procedural disruption during such a dangerous period. Mercer nodded obediently throughout the reprimand, but inside he felt a knot tightening, fueled not by defiance but by frustration that no one seemed willing to acknowledge the escalating pattern of losses. Even after the warning, he found himself unable to dismiss the idea, especially when he watched yet another damaged B-15 being towed into the repair line with its underside shredded by a burst that seemed almost mathematically precise. Each new wreck served as a painful reminder that the enemy's accuracy bordered on predictive, reinforcing every instinct that had driven him to sketch those distorted bird shapes in the dirt. Despite the derision and the threats of punishment, Mercer sensed that the situation had grown too dire to rely solely on existing protocols, and his frustration deepened into a quiet determination that kept him awake long after the floodlights dimmed across the field. As he walked back toward the barracks that night, the distant rumble of engines preparing for the next day's mission echoed across the darkened runway, mixing with the steady hum of waves crashing against the nearby cliffs. Mercer realized that the rejection he had faced was not the end of his idea, but merely the first obstacle standing between him and the possibility of saving the crews who trusted him more than they knew. In the growing darkness, his thoughts coalesced into a single, unwavering conclusion. If no one would authorize the change, then he would have to find another way to make it happen, even if it meant risking his position, his reputation, and whatever future he imagined for himself beyond the war. The decision to defy orders crystallized late one night when the airfield had finally grown quiet, leaving only the soft hiss of wind across the hangar roofs and the distant pulse of generators humming beneath rows of dim floodlights. Mercer waited until the crew chief finished his final inspection rounds and headed toward the officers' quarters, then slipped back into the tool shed, where he had hidden several small tins of leftover primer, charcoal black coating, and faded yellow pigment scavenged from previous repairs. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered the supplies, not from fear of being caught, but from the weight of knowing that he was about to cross a boundary no mechanic was ever meant to approach without explicit authorization. Still, the memory of shredded fuselages and hollow-eyed pilots strengthened his resolve, pushing him past the lingering hesitation that clung to his thoughts. He moved quietly across the tarmac toward the B-15 assigned for the dawn strike, keeping to the shadows cast by parked fuel trucks and stacked ammunition crates, each step muffled by the fine dust that blanketed the wide concrete slabs. The bomber loomed before him like a sleeping giant, its engines cold and its underbelly glowing faintly beneath the scattered work lamps left on by the late-shift crew. Mercer climbed the wooden ladder with slow, deliberate movements, placing each brush and paint tin within reach on the platform beside the nose cone, pausing only to glance over his shoulder to ensure no patrols were approaching from the hangar line. The stillness of the night wrapped around him, amplifying every sound he made and sharpening the sense that he was standing on the edge of something irreversible. Once positioned beneath the fuselage, he dipped his brush into the charcoal paint and began outlining the sweeping curve of a wing, tracing the distorted shapes he had practiced countless times in the dirt behind the maintenance tent. The strokes came slowly at first, guided by caution and the fear of misjudging the proportions, but soon his movements grew smoother as muscle memory from his years of sign painting resurfaced with surprising clarity. He layered the darker pigments along the leading edges of the wings, blending them into jagged, uneven patterns that broke the smooth lines of the aircraft's belly, then added streaks of pale yellow to create the illusion of feathers twisting in motion. With each stroke, the bomber's silhouette transformed into something more fluid and unpredictable, as though the metal skin itself were shifting under the dim lights. The work took far longer than he anticipated, not because the design was overly complex, but because he paused repeatedly to study the evolving shape from different angles, ensuring that the pattern would distort the aircraft's outline when viewed from below during a low-altitude run. He imagined how the rising sun would strike the wings of the painted eagle, casting uneven shadows that might confuse a spotter attempting to calculate trajectory by silhouette alone. As the minutes passed, Mercer found himself immersed in the task, with an intensity that bordered on trance, barely noticing the stiffness in his shoulders or the paint streaks accumulating across his forearms. The transformation unfolding beneath his hands no longer felt like a reckless act of defiance, but a necessary step toward altering the deadly predictability that had claimed too many pilots already. When he finally stepped back from the ladder, the Eagle's wings stretched across the bomber's entire underside, creating a chaotic swirl of shadows and shapes unlike anything authorized by military regulations. The design looked wild, almost feral, yet possessed a strange coherence that made Mercer believe it could truly disrupt the enemy's predictive fire. He wiped a smear of paint from his cheek and scanned the quiet field one last time, feeling the weight of his actions settle across his thoughts as he gathered the brushes and tins into a canvas bag. Although the risk of discovery remained high, a flicker of confidence spread through him, driven by the belief that this unapproved experiment offered a chance, however small, to break the pattern of losses haunting the squadron. As he climbed down from the ladder, the sky had begun to pale with the first hints of dawn, signaling that the crews would soon arrive to prepare the bomber for its mission. Mercer moved swiftly across the tarmac, returning the tools to their hiding place before slipping toward the barracks, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally acted on a conviction too important to ignore. He knew the coming hours would reveal whether his gamble carried any merit, or merely marked him as a reckless mechanic clinging to desperation. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a fragile sense of possibility stirring beneath the anxiety. Whatever happened next, the decision was no longer theoretical. The Eagle had taken flight, and there was no turning back. The first hints of sunlight were cresting over the distant ridge when the flight crew arrived on the tarmac, their footsteps echoing across the hard concrete as they approached the B-15 with the weary determination of men who had survived too many brutal missions. The pilot, Lieutenant Harris, stopped abruptly beneath the nose, blinking twice in disbelief as he took in the sprawling Eagle painted across the aircraft's underside, its jagged wings twisting in uneven strokes that seemed to ripple under the soft morning light. For a long moment no one spoke, and the silence grew heavier as the rest of the crew stepped forward, exchanging confused glances that shifted between amusement, annoyance, and a subtler emotion Mercer recognized as cautious curiosity. Harris finally broke the quiet with a low whistle, muttering that if the artwork didn't confuse the enemy, it would at least give them something to talk about back at base. Despite their initial shock, the crew climbed aboard without raising an official complaint, partly because there was no time to request a replacement aircraft, and partly because the subtle desperation hanging over the squadron made them reluctant to dismiss anything that might tilt the odds in their favor, however slightly. Mercer watched from behind a stack of fuel drums as the engines roared to life, the propellers slicing through the morning haze and sending shimmering waves of heat across the field. As the bomber rolled down the runway and lifted into the pale sky, the painted Eagle seemed to stretch with each shift of the aircraft's angle, creating a swirling pattern that flickered unpredictably against the sea's reflection far below. Mercer held his breath until the aircraft became a distant silhouette, wondering whether his midnight act of defiance would help the crew or condemn them to further danger. Hours later, as the sun climbed high above the coastline, the bomber approached the heavily defended stretch of shore that had claimed so many of its predecessors, descending to attack altitude as the crew prepared for the inevitable convergence of anti-aircraft fire. According to the later debrief, the first bursts erupted ahead of the aircraft as expected, but instead of closing rapidly along a precise predictive arc, the shells fell noticeably wide, creating a scattered pattern that forced the gunners to readjust their aim with frantic urgency. Harris reported that the enemy fire seemed delayed, almost hesitant, as though the spotters were struggling to interpret the bomber's outline through the shifting interplay of sunlight and painted distortion. The Eagle's chaotic shapes broke up the clean geometry of the aircraft's belly, causing the gunners to misjudge both distance and trajectory during the crucial opening seconds of the engagement. As the bomber banked for its attack run, the defensive bursts continued to fall just slightly off target, missing the fuselage by margins so narrow that any trained pilot would have expected at least one direct hit under normal circumstances. The crew's astonishment grew with every second they remained airborne, and the radio operator later admitted that he whispered a quiet prayer of thanks when a full volley passed harmlessly beneath the starboard wing, instead of ripping through the engine nacelle as it had on previous missions. Witnesses and escorting fighters claimed the painted distortions created a shimmering effect that made it difficult to track the bomber's exact position during rapid maneuvers, which may have further complicated the enemy's ability to anticipate its path. When the B-15 finally cleared the defensive perimeter and climbed toward safer altitude, Harris let out a shaky laugh over the intercom, declaring that something about the aircraft's appearance must have thrown the gunners off their rhythm, because he had never seen such wild inaccuracy from positions normally known for brutal efficiency. The crew returned to Henderson Field with only superficial damage, minor shrapnel scratches along the lower fuselage, and their expressions when they disembarked carried the dazed relief of men who expected far worse. Mercer stood at the edge of the tarmac as they approached, and though Harris said nothing at first, he eventually clapped the mechanic on the shoulder with a slow nod that conveyed more gratitude than words could manage. In that unspoken acknowledgement, Mercer sensed that his forbidden experiment had survived its first test, and the faint spark of possibility he carried for days now glowed with renewed, fierce conviction. The atmosphere on the airfield shifted noticeably after Harris's crew filed their mission report, because the officers who normally dissected every engagement with clipped, skeptical precision now found themselves stumbling through descriptions that defied the patterns they had come to expect from the heavily fortified coastline. Several intelligence analysts reread the gun camera footage and charted the trajectory of intercepted bursts, gradually recognizing that the enemy's initial volleys had landed far outside their usual predictive envelope, forcing frantic mid-engagement corrections that revealed genuine confusion rather than tactical recalibration. The anomaly was too significant to ignore, and for the first time in weeks, the operations tent buzzed not with dread but with a cautious, almost uncomfortable sense of curiosity that hinted at the possibility of a breakthrough none of them had anticipated. When Harris was summoned for a more detailed debrief, he struggled to articulate what he had witnessed, admitting repeatedly that the bomber seemed harder to read during its approach, as though the aircraft's position shifted subtly in ways that disrupted the gunner's timing. To the officers listening, the explanation sounded vague and unscientific, yet several junior observers pointed out that even small distortions could wreak havoc on calculations performed by spotters relying solely on training and visual cues. The discussion became increasingly animated as more voices joined in, and soon the curiosity hardened into a demand for a physical inspection of the aircraft itself, prompting a group of officers to follow Harris onto the tarmac with clipboards in hand and tension in their steps. When the group reached the B-15, their initial shock mirrored the crew's earlier reaction, because the swirling eagle painted across the bomber's underside was far more dramatic than the hastily described sketches in the mission report. The jagged wings, uneven feather strokes, and shifting shadow patterns created by the sun's angle combined to produce a distorted silhouette that none of the officers had ever seen on a combat aircraft. For several long moments they simply stared, as if trying to reconcile what they saw with the rigid regulations that governed every aspect of aircraft presentation. Even the crew chief, who had previously dismissed Mercer's idea with absolute certainty, stood silently beside the latter, studying the distorted contours with a conflicted expression that reflected equal parts disbelief and reluctant admiration. After several tense minutes, one of the senior engineers stepped forward and instructed Mercer, who had been waiting nervously at a respectful distance, to describe exactly how he conceived the design and why he believed it affected enemy targeting accuracy. His explanation, though modest and hesitant, drew steady nods from the observers as he outlined how shifting shapes and inconsistent shadows could complicate predictive calculations performed under the pressure of rapid-fire adjustments. For the first time, his idea was not met with laughter or irritation, but with measured consideration, and the realization that his midnight experiment might possess legitimate tactical value sent a quiet ripple of astonishment through the gathered officers. The turning point came when the operations commander, a man known for his uncompromising adherence to regulation, announced that the squadron would authorize a limited trial on 5 additional bombers scheduled for coastal missions over the next week. His decision carried the weight of both authority and risk, acknowledging that the worsening casualty rates demanded a willingness to test unorthodox solutions, even if they challenged long-standing traditions of uniformity and discipline. Mechanics from multiple crews gathered around Mercer as soon as the officers departed, peppering him with questions about paint mixtures, brush techniques, and the specific proportions required to replicate the design effectively. Despite the sudden attention, Mercer remained grounded, quietly instructing his fellow mechanics on how to reproduce the chaotic wing strokes without turning the pattern into a clean, predictable shape that might undermine its purpose. Over the next several nights, the airfield transformed into a clandestine workshop as crews hurried to apply the experimental pattern before sunrise, working under dim lamps that cast eerie silhouettes across the tarmac. The